Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you all. Thank you very much for waiting patiently. Apologies for a bit of a delay, but hopefully we're all on the same page now. My name is Eliana. I've been sending you some emails announcing the event and so on. I am the program manager for the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, or GAHTC, a bit of a mouthful. Our organization is a teacher-to-teacher based organization, meaning that we are in our 7th year of funding by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and our work is to provide teaching material on global architectural history to fellow teachers. So it's a teacher-to-teacher network that produces teaching modules that can be shared on our online library for everyone as a shared resource in this huge endeavor of teaching global survey at the undergraduate level. If you have any questions about our organization or any of our grant funding opportunities, please feel free to reach out to me either in chat or email me. I'm sure that if you reach out to Mohammad and Caitlin, they will also put you in contact with me. That said, I will just say welcome again. Thank you for coming. We're really happy to sponsor this project. It's going to be a really exciting couple of hours ahead, wonderful presentations, and I will begin by introducing our facilitators, Mohammad and Caitlin. Mohammad Garpour is professor and director of architecture graduate program at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. He obtained his PhD in architecture at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He has published 11 books on urban landscape and architectural history and founded the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. His co-facilitator, Caitlin DeClercq, is an assistant director at Columbia University's Center for Teaching and Learning in New York City. She earned a PhD in architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. Her publications engage both academic and practitioner audiences to promote healthy design practices in a range of institutional settings. So I will happily hand it over to Mohammad and Caitlin. Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Just wanted to give a quick welcome and just kind of put a name to the face. I'm Caitlin DeClercq. It's wonderful to see you all here. And this is our symposium, Global Visions on Cities and Historical Pandemics. As I turn the mic over to my colleague, Mohammad, I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Hello, I'm Mohammad Garipur. Today's symposium is part of the Epidemic Urbanism initiative, which Caitlin and I founded in response to COVID-19. Our goal with this initiative is to explore how the outbreak, response to, and lasting impact of epidemic illnesses help us understand urban environments and communities. As part of this initiative, we organize an online symposium entitled Epidemic Urbanism, Reflections on History on May 28 and 29. This symposium consisted of 18 presentations that explored historic pandemics from the 14th to 20th centuries, how they affected urbanism and the built environment, and the implications on our understanding and response to COVID today. A primary finding in our early work so far is the need to recognize the ways in which pandemics, past and present, exploit and amplify social inequalities, an urgent need for scholarship and interventions to work toward more critical, just, and equitable solutions. Our aim in convening today is to bring together academics from a range of disciplines to present case studies from across the globe in order to further explore how cities are not just primary place of exposure and quarantine, but also the site and instrument of intervention. Today, we have convened 13 scholars to present historical case studies from diverse geographies, from the Philippines to Vietnam, Senegal, Nigeria, Brazil, and more. As with our first symposium, each brief presentation will tell the story of an outbreak of infectious illness and its impact on urban life and urban forms. In order to extend and amplify our understanding of epidemic illnesses as both social and spatial phenomena, we have organized these presentations into 3 themes. The first will explore how systems of power and governance, and more specifically, colonialism and imperialism, shape the experience of and response to pandemics. The second will explore the mutual relationship between politics, policies, and public health interventions, and how urban epidemics clarify and extend each. The third will explore the role of social spaces of different sizes, from domestic to city spaces, in responding to epidemic illnesses and the ways in which epidemics shaped each. These presentations will be followed by a response from our discussants and moderators, Dr. Fariba Zarinabaf and Dr. Mehrin Chidarazvi, and time for Q&A at the end. Seen together, these presentations, and indeed this initiative, provoke new insights and implications for our role as historians, architects, planners, scholars, educators, and citizens. This in mind, as with all other conversations we have convened as part of this initiative, a recording of this session will be made available in GHTC as part of a series of materials we are developing to aid the teaching of architecture and urbanism through the lens of epidemic illness. Additionally, we will upload a recording of today's session on our Epidemic Urbanism YouTube channel.
So before we hear from our presenters today, several thanks are in order. First, we want to thank Mehrin Chidarazvi for accepting our invitation to serve as a session moderator, and Fariba Zarinabaf for accepting our invitation to serve as a discussant for today's session. We also want to give thanks to GHTC for their funding and support of our initiative, and in particular for the invitation to be present today. We wish to give special thanks to Eliana Abu-Amdi for her tireless support and expert guidance as we have developed this initiative over recent months. And now we're about to turn the mic over to today's moderator and discussant. Let me introduce them just briefly. Dr. Mehrin Chidarazvi, today's moderator, works for the Khalili Collections in London and is assistant editor for the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. She earned her PhD in the History of Art and Archaeology from SOAS, the University of London. Her publications include journal articles and book chapters on the art, architecture, material culture, and urbanism of Mughal South Asia. Fariba Zarinabaf is today's discussant, and she's a professor of history and the former chair of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She's a specialist in the social and urban history of the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran, as well as the Mediterranean world. Her book publications include Crime and Punishment in 18th Century Istanbul and Mediterranean Encounters, Trade and Pluralism in Early Modern Galata. Our thanks again today to Fariba and Mehrin. Mehrin, the floor and mic are yours.
Thank you so much, Caitlin and Mohammad. Fariba and I are delighted to be here today to moderate this discussion. I want to just briefly say that after the three panels and Fariba's post-panel discussion, we'll be having the Q&A session, and we're welcoming questions from the attendees and the participants. So please write any questions you have in the chat box in Zoom. I'll be moderating that chat box throughout the session today and choosing the questions to put to our participants at the end of the panel session today. I'd also like to remind all the attendees to please keep your microphones and videos muted throughout the session, particularly your microphones, as any background noise can be quite disruptive to the people who are speaking. And now, without any further ado, we're going to begin our first panel on the theme of colonialism, imperialism, and urbanism. And I hand over to Fariba to introduce the panel speakers.
Thank you, Mehrin. Thank you, Mohammad and Caitlin, for inviting me to get involved in this wonderful workshop. I'm going to introduce the first three panelists one by one. And I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your names correctly. Professor Michael Vann is Associate Professor of History at California State University, Sacramento. He holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He specializes in the history of the French colonial empire and has published 3 books titled The Colonial Good Life and de Joyaux's Vision of French Indochina, 20th Century Voices, Selected Readings in World History, and The Great Hanoi Renhunt, Empire, Disease, and Modernity in French Colonial Vietnam. The title of his talk today is French Colonialism, the City, and Pandemics in Vietnam, 1885 to 1921.
Thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank the organizers for setting up this wonderful session. And also I want to acknowledge I'm coming to you from Santa Cruz, California, which is originally Ohlone land, settled first by Spanish and then American colonizers. So my contribution to this project is a study of Hanoi under French colonial rule. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. Hanoi is a city over 1,000 years old and was a historic capital of Vietnam. But when the French occupied it in the 1880s, it was merely a provincial city, provincial administrative city, as the Nguyen dynasty had moved the capital to Hue in central Vietnam. Later on, the French would make it a capital of the federated Indo-Chinese colonies. But at the point of the occupation, it was merely a provincial city. Located on the bank of the Red River, Hanoi was and is a very wet city due to both local rainfall and the incredible amount of water coming out of the greater Himalayan watershed down the Red River. Pre-colonial Hanoi, pre-French Hanoi, as you see on this map, had many lakes, fish ponds, and canals that allowed boats to enter into the city and come right into what's now called the Old Quarter of Hanoi. When the French conquered Hanoi, they took a disdainful view of this water world and set to draining the city. They filled in ponds and closed up canals. Fighting waterborne diseases, particularly cholera, justified these urbanist moves. Can we have the next slide, please? Great. In the 1890s, the French put in state-of-the-art sewers and a fresh water system. However, colonial Hanoi was a classic dual city with a racial divide between white and Asian access to the benefits of the city's new urban infrastructure. While French villas had running water and flush toilets, most of the Vietnamese and Chinese residents of the Old Quarter had to collect water from public fountains, and pre-dawn night soil collectors removed human waste in buckets. This part of the city really only had gutter drains in the streets, not proper sewers. While these moves helped fight cholera, a disease ironically brought to Hanoi by the French Expeditionary Force coming from Algeria in the 1880s, these sewers created a new health crisis. At the same time that the French were rebuilding Hanoi, a bubonic plague epidemic in Yunnan made its way to Canton and Hong Kong. From there, it struck British India. American troops brought it to Manila when they invaded the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. It struck my hometown of Honolulu, leading to the burning down of the local Chinatown before it hit San Francisco, where municipal authorities quarantined that Chinatown and discussed a, quote, Honolulu solution to the epidemic, essentially burning down San Francisco's Chinatown. Now, back to Asia, French researchers such as Alexandre Yersin and Paul Simon, Alexandre Yersin in Hong Kong and Paul Simon in Bombay, made crucial discoveries about rat fleas being the vector in the spread of the plague bacillus. As fate would have it, Governor General Paul Doumer ordered Yersin to Hanoi in 1902 to found a medical school. Yersin and other medical experts in the city were concerned about the plague arriving from southern China on the newly established steamship lines and railway link to Yunnan. Next slide. The situation became more serious when French residents reported an infestation of rats in the French Quarter. It seemed that brown rats arrived on ships and trains from southern China. This invasive species discovered that the new sewers were an ideal ecosystem and quickly colonized the colonizers' urban infrastructure. The situation was so bad that there were reports of rats climbing up the outflow pipes of the sewers and then out of the toilets in French homes. This was unpleasant enough, but the realization that these rats could be carrying plague-bearing fleas threw the public health officials into panic. And again, Yersin, Alexandre Yersin, in the French historiography is known as the conqueror of the plague. He's in Hanoi at this time and is one of the local medical experts. Using their new knowledge, the colonial public health officials began a campaign of rat eradication. I guess we could call it eradication. Cue laugh track. However, problems began immediately when Vietnamese sewer workers refused the unpleasant task of hunting rats in the sewers and went out on strike. When the city officials put out a bounty on rats, paying a few cents for each rat tail delivered to the police station, hundreds of thousands of rats seemed to be killed. However, after 3 months of this program, they discovered the local community was farming rats, cutting off their tails to collect the bounty, then letting them go free to breed more rats. and more tails to get more pennies. Then they found a smuggling network bringing rats and other rodents from all over Tonkin to the city of Hanoi, and the program was scrapped. In the end, the French authorities realized that very intense and very invasive public health measures, such as quarantining the sick in lazarettes, burning the belongings and oftentimes the homes of the sick, so I'm wrapping up here, and seizing corpses were more effective. However, these measures angered the local population. The relevance of this case study to this current COVID era is threefold. First, large cities and industrialized transportation will lead to disease outbreaks. Our modern infrastructure creates potentials for epidemics. Second, public health measures are always disruptive and unpopular. Third, there's a long history of xenophobia and pandemic disease. As with anti-Semitism and the Black Death, scapegoating Chinese bodies and China as a whole was a factor then and now. And thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We are moving to our second speaker. Yichi Zhang is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. He received his PhD from the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. His research interests include transnational architecture production, modern Chinese urban and garden history, the history of British settlements in China, and conservation of historical garden and heritage sites. He will present today on the Hong Kong plague and the park movement of the British settlements in Shanghai and Tianjin, China in 1894.
Hello, everybody. And my presentation will contribute to this panel by uncovering the relationship between the Hong Kong plague and the park movement in the British settlements in Shanghai and Tianjin. British settlements were Chinese territories administered by the British people, and the British settlements in Shanghai was founded in 1845, while that of Tianjin in 1860. These two settlements, not only together with Hong Kong, served as a key node of the British trade network in the East Asia, but also became the locus for the creation of new designed landscapes during this phase of China's semi-colonial encounter. So next. And the Hong Kong plague broke out in Guangzhou in February 1894, killing 60,000 people in a few weeks, and repeatedly spread into the nearby city of Hong Kong, causing 80,000 deaths in the following months. As these cities were seaports, the plague soon infected other countries and cities via ships. Given the close trade links between Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and other treaty ports, the residents in the British settlements in Tianjin and Shanghai awoke to the seriousness of this trade and attempted to develop measures to protect their own health. Next. Since the popular idea on public health in Britain at the time was that the illness was caused by the environment, the residents drew attention to improve urban landscapes. However, the public parks in the settlements were mainly used to beautify the city, and the settlers started to introduce the function of public health into the public parks. This includes three measures. The first one, the municipal council attempted to reconstruct the waste ground of the settlements into public parks, but to protect against was the manners to all the settlements in common. For example, Shanghai Municipal Council filled a pond at Kunshan Street to form the Hongkou Park in 1896. Also, Tianjin also developed Queen's Park on a waste ground. The second point, the urban authorities also employed parks as a tool to change the people's activities that would harm public health. For example, the people always dealt with the waste on the street, so they introduced the toilets into the parks, such as Victoria Parks in Tianjin, Public Garden, and Kongkou Parks in Shanghai. The third point, the urban authorities introduced the new facilities into the parks to improve public health, considering that the adequate supply of clean water would play a key role in urban health. They introduced the drinking function into the public parks. So we can see this is the picture, and this is the picture, and it's a drinking fountain at the Jesville Park in Shanghai. So this is all promoted public parks to be a place to improve the public health. Next. With the fast urbanization in the early 20th century, the residents required the urban authorities to develop more parks in the settlement to deal with the urban disease. However, the land price did not allow the municipal council to purchase large fields with settlements. Thus, the urban authorities introduced the idea of park system from European cities and intended to develop pocket parks to connect large municipal parks into a system to maximize the improvement on public health. The authorities suggest that a small park should be with half a mile of each resident. Hint, the British settlements in Shanghai and Tianjin all form their own park system. So this picture and shows the park system in Tianjin. And the construction of these small parks all followed the layout of the municipal parks, has toilets and drinking fountains and everything. Consequently, public parks stayed into the normal urban landscape layouts and ordinary lives of settlers, becoming a necessity with the city from an encounter to beautify the city. So according to the above discussion, you can see, although the Hong Kong plague was a disaster, it in some degree acted a positive effect. That is, promoting the introduction of idea on public health into the public parts of the British settlements in Shanghai and Tianjin, and thereby promoted the involvement of these designed landscapes. Yeah, that's all.
So what we're going to do then is now move on to the second panel on politics, policies, and public health. And our first speaker in this panel is Mohammad Hussain, who recently completed his MA in Civilization Studies from the Alliance of Civilizations Institute at Haldun University in Istanbul. His thesis was titled Ecology, Epidemics, and the Colonial State, Environmental Change and Health in the Eastern Bengal Delta, 1858 to 1947. His research interests include environmental history and epidemics in South Asia. And thank you. Please go ahead, Mohammad.
Thank you very much. So, hello everybody, and I thank the GATC panel for inviting me to discuss about my thesis. So I will be speaking to you about state epidemics and ecology in East Bengal from 1858 to 1947. Next slide, please. So in order to put my presentation into context, this is the geography which I'm speaking about. The Bengal Delta is the largest delta in the world, and it is home to the GBM system, which is the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna system. It consists of two sections. One is the eastern and the western. The eastern section is the active section, and the center of the section is in Dhaka, while the western part is the moribund delta, and as we know, it's home to Calcutta. So historically speaking, after the British takeover of Bengal in 1757, so the capital of the British Empire was set in Western Bengal, in Calcutta, while former administrative centers in Eastern Bengal, such as Dhaka and Murshidabad, they suffered socio-politically and economically. So as we have seen from recent scholarship, scholars such as Richard Eaton and C.A. Bentley, they have shown that the moribund part of the Bengal Delta is associated with a higher incidence of disease such as malaria and cholera. Next slide, please. So the argument of my thesis is that the colonial efforts to combat epidemic disease in Dhaka in Eastern Bengal failed mainly due to two reasons. One is that the colonial medical institutions and health infrastructure in the 19th and early 20th century were disproportionately distributed and remained inadequate. Secondly, the human ecological actions such as colonial developments and attitudes leading to the loss of the ecological balance in the Bengal Delta, contributed to famine conditions and a hyperendemicity of epidemic disease. So in order to substantiate this, I would like to go to the next slide. So in this slide, as you can see, it speaks of a tabular comparison of health infrastructure for the general populace between the western and eastern part of the Bengal Delta under the British colonial administration. So despite a higher population in Dhaka, we find that the health infrastructure is disproportionately distributed and it's inadequate considering the population versus the amount of hospitals and hospital beds. Next slide, please. So in order to substantiate my second point, according to which the colonial development projects, which led to a loss of ecological balance, actually contributed to a higher incidence of disease. We see that human ecological actions were responsible for diseases such as malaria and cholera and their increase. And this started off from the end of the 19th century, specifically from the 1870s, when initiatives such as the East Bengal Railway was set up. And from this, we see a direct relation of the distribution of malaria to the distribution of roads and railways in Bengal. So the eastern part, which has a lower proportion of railways, also has a lower proportion of disease such as malaria, while the western part, which has a higher proportion of development, includes, is also home to higher incidence of malaria. So next slide, please. And in order to understand this better, we will see that the river system in Eastern Bengal and in Western Bengal is from north to south. It flows from north to south. And the railways in the Bengal Delta were built in an east to west direction. So this led to a choking of the waterways, which contributed to kind of destruction of natural habitats, such as the Cholon Beel, and even the different kind of beels in and around Dhaka. And this choking led to a high incidence of disease and actually aided in the high mortality of the 1943 Great Bengal Famine. And finally, before I end, I would just like to give an idea about the relevance of my study to urbanism in the COVID area. So as we have seen that in the colonial era, the centralization of health infrastructure in a specific area, which is Calcutta, actually was a huge problem for the population of the area, and this trend has continued till today. We have centralization in modern day Bangladesh as well, where we see that COVID hospitals are found mainly in Dhaka, but not outside Dhaka. So huge regions can contain a single specialized hospital for COVID, unlike in Dhaka, where we have several hospitals. So this leads to a problem of healthcare for patients, and towards that, there is a need for decentralization and reconsideration of ecologically adverse actions, such as the destruction of the wetlands of Dhaka, the formation of huge bridges without any kind of environmental ecological impact study. And towards this end, I would like to end my discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mohammad. Our next presentation is a group project by Fernando Delgado Paez, Niuxa Drago, and Ana Paula Polizzo, and I apologize for the mispronunciations. Fernando is a professor of architecture at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, from where he also obtained his master's in architecture and where he's currently a PhD candidate. His publications and research are focused on history and theory of architectural design. Niuxa is an architect, also a professor in the Faculty of Architecture in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and she's a researcher at their graduate program in architecture. She obtained her PhD in Scenic Arts from the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. Her studies focus on Rio de Janeiro's urban and architectural history. Ana, too, is an architect, a professor at the university's Faculty of Architecture, and also a researcher at their graduate program in architecture. She obtained her PhD in Social History of Culture at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Her studies focus on Brazilian and Latin American architecture and landscape design. And now Fernando will share their work with us.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Mohammad and Caitlin, for the organization of this great symposium. And thank you also for inviting us to participate. Next slide, please. The largest armed conflict in South America, the Paraguayan War, lasted from 1864 to 1817. The number of deaths among Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina armies was around 80,000 men, more than half of them due to diseases, mainly cholera. With the end of the war, it is believed that the return of the soldiers caused the biggest yellow fever epidemic of Buenos Aires. The first health convention that brought these three countries together in 1873 intended to combat such epidemics that, in addition to damaging the sea trade, undermined the immigration policies of the three countries. Although legal slavery of Africans still prevailed in Brazilian Empire, it was intended to replace these workers by European ones as a way of whitening the population. Along with urban sanitation works, this was considered as a civilizing measure. In this first South American Health Convention, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay assented to build lazaretos and to equalize the quarantine policies. Although not ratified, this convention signifies the first regional public health pact, understood as the basis for the development of economic and political issues. Next slide, please. To build an exemplary lazaretto, engineer Paula visited several islands of the coast of Rio de Janeiro. His report on the choice of Ilha Grande demonstrates his concern with isolation and environmental issues, since theories were divided between human-to-human transmission hypothesis and that of miasmatic causes. His brief architectural analysis of lazarettos suggests that he had access to European treatises. John Howard's treatise had been translated into Portuguese and probably landed in Brazil with the Portuguese court in 1808. However, graduated at the Polytechnic School of Rio, which had a strong influence of the French École de Pont-Chaussée, Paula seems closer to Louis Bruguière's treatise. Reproducing the judgments of Bruguière, he also condemns the confined composition of the Ancona Lazaretto and cites the typology of Trompelot Lazaretto, influenced by Bruguière, as the most appropriate. Next slide, please. At the Ilha Grande Lazaretto, there were two pavilions for passengers, one with a closet shape and central court for third-class passengers that were accommodated in large rooms. 300 meters above, another building consists of 4 wings, 2 dedicated to the second class and 2 to the first class. Smaller cells in the first class wings provided greater privacy and health security. The classes had separate refectories and livings, and the Lazaretto regulations clearly state that they must receive differentiated treatments. Next slide, please. The sanitary treatment itself was clearly differentiated, since the wings of the first and second class pavilions are more isolated and have the same orientation, and the patios between them are landscaped. Consulting the extensive work of Joaquín Bonastra on quarantine architecture around the world, we were unable to find such visible architectural differences between passengers' pavilions. This architectural arrangement by classes even harms the need for isolation. The Ilha Grande Lazaretto was designed following principles of social distancing already proposed by Howard, Bruguière, and many others, accommodating passengers in different pavilions. However, here, pavilions do not separate passengers due to the risk of contamination, but primarily because of their wealth. This case study demonstrates the conflict between scientific issues and social hierarchies, here evident in the architectural project, and materialized today in the issues of property law and urban sanitation. It also highlights the importance of international strategies, unfortunately not outlined on the continent in the relation of the current pandemic. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for presenting your group's work. Our third speaker of the panel is Alan Shotwell, a professor of history at Ivy Tech Community College and director of the Center for Humanities and Medicine. He earned his PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Indiana University in the USA, and he has published a number of works on the history of anatomy and medicine. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. So today I'm talking about Terre Haute, Indiana, a small city on the western edge of the state. In the first 5 years of the 20th century, smallpox outbreaks occurred in cities across the US after a period of relative inactivity. Municipal authorities in big cities like New York or Boston and small ones like Terre Haute generally had two approaches to combating the disease: quarantine and vaccination. I'm interested here in how these tools were employed by the authorities of Terre Haute, and especially in the visual aspects of that employment. So I'm going to have the next slide, please. The city's response to the disease was almost immediately, a hot political topic. The mayor and the city council were Democrats, and the Republican newspaper, the Daily Tribune, routinely criticized their handling of the disease, especially in financial terms. Political cartoons rapidly became the main vehicle for that criticism. When the City Board of Health asked for increased funding to pay for quarantine efforts in January, their request was ignored by the City Council, prompting the Daily Tribune's political cartoonist, Harry Larimer, to depict the Democrats walking arm in arm with the specter of plague away from a shuttered and locked health department. Pressure increased when the City Council did approve funding for purchasing land for a city park about a month later for 10 times as much money as the Board of Health had asked for. Larimer's political cartoon in response combined medical and political imageries depicting the city's government as a quack doctor trying to force an enormous park pill down the throat of people of Terre Haute. Medical themes and imagery continued in political cartoons in the newspaper throughout the winter of 1902 and 1903. But newspaper imagery responded to the funding aspects of quarantine, while another form of visual rhetoric was employed for vaccination. Slide 2, the next slide, please. Terre Haute was home to the secretary of the Anti-Vaccination Society of America, Frank Blue. Blue had already successfully sued the school corporation over mandatory vaccinations in the 1890s. When the smallpox epidemic hit in 1902, the school corporation once again tried to enforce vaccination and faced opposition from the anti-vaccination group. Unvaccinated children were prohibited from attending school, but many came anyway, prompting struggles between the schools and the parents. Several anti-vaxxers were lawyers, and they managed to get an injunction against the school ban that eventually allowed students to come whether vaccinated or not. Next slide, please. To encourage vaccination, the city officials from both the state government and the city government adopted a bold tactic. They took pictures of victims in advanced stages of smallpox and publicly displayed them in the shop windows. One of their chosen sites was Bauer's Drugstore downtown, an iconic location in the city's history with deep ties to famous residents like Eugene Debs, the socialist. The city also offered free vaccination at Rose Dispensary, a building long associated with charitable medical care in the community and just 1 block north of Bowers, so that the hundreds of people affected by the smallpox photos could easily get a vaccine regardless of their financial status. While many of these artifacts of the city's responses to the epidemic are no longer visible, the controversial park still remains, and the struggles between the health experts, city authorities, and public opinion sound familiar to us in the age of COVID. It's worth noting that the smallpox epidemic continued in Terre Haute through the next election cycle. The Democrats were swept from power, but the new Republican governments faced the same old problems. The new director of the Board of Health asked for 10 times as much money as his predecessor and was soundly turned down. There was another legal case involving school vaccinations, and this time the judge in charge ordered a break in quarantine to bring the plaintiff to court, prompting members of the Board of Health to walk out of the courtroom. Perhaps most interesting of all, the two main players in that case, the director of the Board of Health, Dr. W.E. Bell, and the anti-quarantine plaintiff, A.R. Markle, continued to do business and live next to each other in the city in the years following the epidemic. And this is perhaps a hopeful sign for us in our own time that the divisions between different members of the public and the government and society are not caused by epidemics are not a permanent factor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. The last speaker of this panel is Timothy Osei Odevale, who is the head of the Department of Architecture at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. He earned his PhD in architecture from the Lincoln School of Architecture at the University of Lincoln in England, and he has published over 70 research articles in book chapters, journals, and refereed conference proceedings. And he's also spent the last 10 years examining the sociocultural factors that impinge or shape the built environment in a rapidly globalized world. Timothy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Timothy Odeyale from Nigeria. I'm going to be talking about Lagos, Lagos colony, urban transformation and public health. I hope I'm clear. Can you hear me, please? Okay. So we need to know that 1 out of 5 African is a Nigerian. That makes it important to talk about Nigeria, because if you take the population of the whole world and of Africa indeed, and of Lagos at the moment is about 25 million people. So when we talk about 1918, it's even a large crowd then when we have large people gathering together in a particular place. So the colonial masters, the British, colonized Africa and partly southern part of Nigeria. And then in 1914, Lord Lugard put together, amalgamated, the North and the South to form what we call the Nigerian Protectorate in 1914. So from there, the British have a strong hold on the activities that's happened in Nigeria, and they give a kind of yearly report back to His Majesty in London. Next slide, please. So we have this spread of influencer, it's a common knowledge now of what happened in 1918. It will have been a case of not affecting Africa, but because of the effect of globalization, let's see globalization then, started happening. We have soldiers that went to fought in the First World War. Nigeria participated in people from Lagos colony were taken there. And when they are coming back, we learned that from oral history that some of them brought back this disease to the coastal part of Nigeria, which is Lagos colony itself. So, and it affected the population so much that people are dying on the streets. Over 500,000 people died as a result of this disease out of 18 million people in Nigeria. So the disease is called lukuluku because it strikes people and they become so comatose. They won't be able to move their hand or their leg, apart from even not be able to breathe very well. So the British people, the government, colonial government then created isolation points or quarantine places to put people together. And but unfortunately, the problem that we are seeing now in the recent times, when isolation points become a place of infection, people started having problems, and due to improvement in transportation, the disease moved from the coastal part even to the inner part of Nigeria and spread quickly to Ibadan, to Bida, to Kano, to Abeokuta, to other parts of Nigeria, even Enugu, and people started dying in Port Harcourt, dying in droves. And we even learned that there's no place to bury people, according to oral history or oral tradition that we got from people. The little we know about what happened then, we got them from the reports by the colonial government about the number of deaths of people that died during the problem, during this disease. We are told that many of these people coming from the ship, there's no kind of a kind of superintendent of these people coming down from the ship, and they just mingle with people anyhow, and they spread that disease to others. We are told that the the British government are more concerned about European or the British people that are found in the Lagos colony, and that the lack of attention to the indigenous also helped the spread of the disease to other parts of the hinterland. And we are told that the new transportation means done by the British government, having a kind of imperial government then having a kind of railway and new cars or motor vehicles, also led to the rapid spread of this pandemic in our own part of the world. So it's a problem. So what are the points that we need to note? Let's go to the next slide, please, because we need to note that the poor housing condition available then, they brought this problem to a very high point, that the British government, the imperial government, noticed that they have to do something about the poor condition of the local people. Initially, they are not concerned. They felt, they saw themselves out along the line. But because of the droves of people that died, this period, they have to give account to the London office and all that. So they have to now come back and think of ways to, put these things together to resolve the problem of overcrowding and poor living conditions in this part of, some part of Lagos, like Ebute Metta, like Yaba. They have to look inward. So if you can zoom into the map by the left of the, we can see the map of the area. Interestingly, because of this development, they created what we call GRA, Government Reserve Area, and just be able to put things together. Government reserve areas that only for Europeans to live, just to be able to reduce the spread of these influenza among the people. They also have what we call health officers, who are created to go around. So because of the impact of these problem of the epidemic, it's led to establishment of many things that we are still enjoying today, even in the modern Nigeria. The urbanization problem led to instituting what we call Wole, the health officers. Then we also have what we call the indigenous doctors took charge, like the man I showed there, Dr. Shakmara and Dr. R.K. Randall. They contributed a lot in bringing knowledge of the culture and local medicine to attack the problem of the influenza, because there's very little or no drugs from the Western world. So they have to look inward into Africa, into Lagos, to Interland, to get some local herbs to help to conquer these problems. Next slide, please. So we have all these issues coming up, and they have to look for ways to manage the situation. And what we are seeing now about using of face mask is not just starting. We have the kind of four issues coming up in Lagos and other parts of Nigeria. They have to look for ways to help to cover their nose and to arrange the beds. And so because of these huge disease that kill many people, it changed the lifestyle of people. They have to respond more to how to take care of the environment, the hygiene, how to take care of their surroundings, take care of their houses, how to cut the bushes around and the grasses around. So it has a lot of a kind of impact on the lifestyle and culture of the people. Apart from the culture itself, it has impact on the land, what we call land partitioning. Europeans have to think of ways, the British government in Nigeria then, of how to isolate places so that it can reduce the spread of diseases and problems in the colony. So all these are high points that we can note, and we can take as learning points to help us to checkmate what we're even seeing now at the COVID-19 of recent times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timothy. I believe we have Gregory back now, so we're going to bring him back to do his presentation from the end of the first panel. Gregory, if you can just confirm that you're here, then Fariba will introduce you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, brilliant.
Wonderful. Well, I certainly apologize for the technical issues. It's always a fun roller coaster with Zoom. But first, thank you for your patience, and thank you for inviting me to present today. Burned homes and angry residents dotted Dakar's landscape in 1914. They appeared when official efforts to combat a plague outbreak turned homes into central sites to justify, enact, or resist segregation in colonial Dakar. Next slide, please. At the time, Dakar served as the capital of French West Africa. Lying at the edge of the Cap Vert Peninsula, the city had been a French possession since 1857. By 1914, the city had nearly 30,000 residents. Many colonists dreamed of using paved boulevards, grandiose government buildings, and residential segregation to make Dakar an emblem of French imperialism. However, the segregation aspect of this dream was difficult to achieve. Laws dating back to the 1848 abolition of slavery in the French Empire meant that many French and many African-born individuals in the cities could vote, claim certain citizens' rights, and use French courts. Enfranchised African urbanites used these tools regularly to challenge French exclusionary policies. Yet when the bubonic plague hit, the political calculus changed. Senegal's plague response fit into a broader colonial link between the plague and indigenous dwellings. First documented in southern China in 1894, this plague outbreak spread to major ports across the globe by the turn of the century. Across Africa, this inspired what historians have called the sanitation syndrome. Colonial officials pinned the bubonic plague spread on indigenous urbanites' supposed unwillingness or inability to make homes that met European hygiene standards. Colonial governments across Africa thus responded to the plague by burning down indigenous neighborhoods and doubling down on urban segregation. And French colonists were no different. They had long denigrated Dakar's straw huts, next slide please, such as these photographed in a 1908 Public Works report, as unhygienic, impermanent, and backwards. Furthermore, during the 1914 plague outbreak, French journalists and officials in Dakar claimed that Africans were secretly burying bodies underneath their dwellings in defiance of health regulations. French colonists presented these domestic practices as proof of African Dakarois' refusal to act like responsible urban citizens during a crisis. They called for Africans' removal from the city's center, known as the Plateau, and hundreds of state-sponsored house incinerations took place as a result. Furthermore, Dakar's African residents were heavily encouraged to relocate to a segregated community just north of the plateau called the Medina. French authorities claimed that these measures would create a segregated city where, as the governor put it, quote, the natives could feel at home, end quote. However, segregating Dakar was easier said than done. To begin with, French law largely prohibited explicit mentions of race. However, more important than these legal constraints were the actions of Dakar's African residents themselves. Angry crowds regularly confronted health agents trying to burn down neighborhoods, and workers organized the first general strike in French West Africa in May 1914. When the local French press deemed these events riots, next slide please, the Senegalese socialist newspaper, La Démocratie du Sénégal, defended the legitimacy of protesters' grievances and the calm demeanor with which they made their demands. Eventually, the government agreed to slow down home destructions and compensate individuals for any personal goods the state had turned to ashes. These compromises helped African residents document and contest how anti-plague measures had transformed their domestic lives. Indemnities often took time, with some processes going into the early 1920s. French bureaucrats had to field angry letters from Senegalese homeowners demanding repayment for burned fishing poles, armoires, beds, and jewelry. Within these pages, a new political use of home emerged. Homeowners used these proceedings to turn domestic spaces so recently demonized by the state into the bases for economic and political claims. Residents tried to get the state to rebuild the domestic lives that it had upended. Furthermore, although thousands of African residents did move to the Medina, many continued to live in the European Plateau district. By refusing to move or critiquing home destruction measures, African residents challenged official dreams of a segregated Dakar. These conflicts over the plague and segregation in colonial Senegal resonate with contemporary debates about race, home, and public health amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Like the plague, COVID-19 has been directly linked to homes. Impoverished inhabitants of cities like Rio de Janeiro or Mumbai are often labeled as potential vectors or victims because of how they live. The story of Dakar's plague offers insight to how and why individuals resist such pandemic-related marginalization. Just like in Dakar, the era of COVID-19 has seen a massive wave of protests, petitions, and strikes. People are demanding the right and means to live lives of dignity and safety. Whether in Minneapolis, Paris, or Cape Town, protesters have challenged the forces of structural racism that are all too often at the heart of urban inequality. Dakar's plague history reveals how pandemics like COVID-19 and the bubonic plague can elicit heated battles over the role of racial inequality in determining who gets to live and feel at home in modern cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gregory. Okay, we're going to be moving ahead to the third panel now. And can I just say how brilliant all of the speakers have been in keeping to time. So our next panel, the third panel, is on community and domestic space. And the first speaker is Luisa Erochi. and she's an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington in Seattle. She obtained her PhD in the history of art and architecture from Boston University, and her research focuses on the architecture and culture of Anglo-America and Europe in the 19th and 20th century. Louisa, are you there?
I am. I don't see myself, but.
Okay, there you are. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. The 1918 influenza pandemic is considered to be one of the most deadly infectious disease outbreaks of all time, infecting a third of the world's population and killing at least 20 million people. The virulent respiratory illness known as the Spanish flu made its way in a series of waves across the United States between 1918 and 1919, coinciding with the final months of World War I. This paper examines the role of the American city as a field hospital by examining the way that Seattle and Washington state responded to the epidemic. The physical infrastructure of built forms and public spaces was modified to serve as a temporary network to contain and manage the spread of people, germs, and information. Civic authorities, aided by the local press, deployed the city as their primary tactical instrument in the war against this invisible enemy. Next slide, please. By the time the deadliest wave of influenza reached Seattle in the fall of 1918, the largest city in the Pacific Northwest had been forewarned of its devastating effect. Mayor Olaf Hansen and Public Health Commissioner Dr. J.S. McBride announced a series of drastic steps that included a ban on public gatherings and the immediate closure of all theaters, moving picture halls, pool rooms, churches, schools, and libraries. A special influenza squad of police officers was dispatched to enforce the order, placing locks on doors and arresting owners who refused to comply. Only people who worked in war-related industries or for food and drug stores were permitted downtown. Everyone was required to wear a gauze mask in public, and streetcars ordered to keep all of their windows open. The blank shuttered storefronts of the city's once lively places of entertainment now displayed official notices with only masked workers remaining in this city gone dark. Next slide, please. The coordination between the mayor's office and public health department gave the response the authority of a military campaign. While the general public was told to stay at home, those who were ill were initially told to admit themselves to a hospital. Physicians were driven in motor cars by police attendants to respond to calls and escort patients. As existing facilities reached capacity, officials announced that shuttered city buildings like halls and churches would be repurposed to serve as temporary hospitals. The most well-publicized was the emergency hospital that took over the third floor of the old courthouse building with separate wards for men and women and a, quote, modern sanitary kitchen. The public was assured of the cleanliness and efficiency of the facility and the professionalism of the care. But frequent reports of deaths and even escapes from the facility suggest the old courthouse hospital was seen to be the destination for the, quote, destitute sick to go to die. As flu cases rose, the health commissioner accused industrial workers of unclean behaviors like open spitting and coughing, and of waiting too long to seek treatment. Living in congested rooming houses and hotels and riding streetcars to work, these transient residents were singled out as the culprits who were driving up the death rate. Next slide, please.
The image of the city as a place of contagion, occupied by masses of diseased bodies, was reinforced in dire reports of morgues overflowing with the dead. Citizens were repeatedly warned to keep their bodies, homes, and streets clean, told that fresh air and even abundant rain would help to clean germs. In late November, the health department opened public inoculation stations to administer an anti-influenza serum free of charge, prioritizing wartime workers. Although the vaccine was certainly ineffective, the provision of this service helped to allay fears, offering familiar sites like police stations, libraries, and department stores as temporary dispensaries. In December, an official quarantine of influenza victims was finally ordered, health officials nailing yellow placards on hundreds of homes. By February 1919, when the epidemic finally ebbed, Seattle emerged with one of the lowest mortality rates on the West Coast, substantially lower than other cities in the country its size. Restoring the health of the city was celebrated as a military victory that involved the entire community, from public officials to ordinary citizens. While never realized, a memorial hospital was proposed as the most fitting monument to the victims of the war. The city of Seattle had served as both the primary target and weapon in the battle against influenza, an enemy from the outside that exposed the inequities within. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Our next speaker is Marianne Alabanza Akers, professor in city and regional planning at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland, in the USA. She obtained her PhD in urban planning from Michigan State University, and she's published in the areas of urban environments and street vendors, active learning and biophilic design, and also community design.
Building a community in Leprosy Island in the Philippines, 1906 to 1941. The Philippines is located in Southeast Asia, south of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, east of Vietnam. Spain set foot in the Philippines in 1521 through an expedition to seek Spice Islands in the Orient. The Spanish established the Philippines as its outpost in Asia, imposing the Catholic religion and Spanish style of governance throughout more than 7,000 islands. During the colonizers' 333-year rule, the religious Franciscan and Dominican missionaries took the responsibility of treatment and healthcare management of the three most common diseases: diarrhea, dysentery, and leprosy. Leprosy was brought to the Philippines in 1635 through a mocking gesture from the Japanese emperor, who sent a shipload of Japanese Christian lepers, a retribution after learning that the Spaniards intended to convert them to Catholicism. Instead of shunning the lepers, the Franciscan order installed a leprosarium in the existing San Lazaro Hospital in Manila. Two other centers were established south of Manila. But the Catholic friars were church institutions with limited knowledge of modern ways to eradicate the disease. Instead, the lepers were allowed to live and roam freely. In 1896, the Philippine Revolution took place, forcing the Spaniards to flee. The abandonment of the leprosarium intensified the spread of the disease. The American imperial control over the Philippines started in 1898 when Spain ceded the country to the United States. The new government prioritized health because their soldiers were suffering from these tropical diseases. To curtail leprosy, they gathered the lepers and segregated them. Culion Island was an ideal place, with its cool climate, harbor, and abundance of water. Although there were a few fisher folk living there, with a stone church, municipal hall, and a few houses, The Americans felt it could be developed with minimal infrastructure. Dr. Heiser, the Director of Health for the Philippines, opened the island as a leper colony with 365 lepers. Native huts were built along street lines, water and sewer systems installed, and a 100-bed hospital constructed. Father Valles, a Jesuit priest, and 4 Sisters of Charity of St. Paul with charters tended to the needs of the lepers. Culion Island grew to about 6,000 inhabitants, and a strong sense of community and belonging emerged. The lepers elected a presidente and concejales, or councillors. Women, who made up about 1/3 of the leper colony, had full suffrage. Boys played baseball, the old and young sang American songs when they gathered, a band was formed. In spite of their physical challenges, the people cultivated gardens and grew livestock. Initially separated, the men and women yearned for family life and were eventually allowed to marry. But their children, who did not have the disease, were separated and sent to another part of the island, the non-leper section. The continued use of a certain oil, the Kalmugra oil, produced a consequent cure. In 1920 to 21, under the support of American Governor General Leonard Wood, a research institute was established in the island to study leprosy. As a decline in cases occurred, the island admitted less patients. It was in the 1970s that the island was declared free of the disease. Pandemics, like leprosy in the early 1900s, is similar to our current COVID situation. As a spatial issue, the efficacy of isolation and segregation was seen. But in the case of Culion, the inhabitants made use of their resources and were with each other to build their own community, a testament to the resiliency of the human spirit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are going to move to the last 2 panelists in our last panel. Homa Gupta is a postdoctoral humanities research fellow at New York University in Abu Dhabi, UAE. She obtained her PhD in history, theory, and criticism of architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She has published numerous articles on urban and architectural history and is currently working on 2 books entitled Dwelling and the Architecture of Dispossession and A Brief History of the Evaluation of Rural Architecture. The title of her talk today is Epidemics Between Dwelling and Building in 1950s Baghdad.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And I just wanted to thank Mohammad, Caitlin, and the GHTC for having me here today. Next slide, please. In the 1950s and 60s, the World Health Organization identified smallpox as one of 6 diseases threatening global health. It advised countries to employ population and travel containment measures, establish detailed surveillance protocols, and embark nationwide inoculation campaigns. In Iraq, smallpox eradication coincided with centralization attempts of the Hashemite monarchic state, and exponential growth in oil revenues further fueled the rapid expansion of financial, medical, statistical, and urban planning apparatuses of the state. Each of these worked in concert with one another to not only eradicate smallpox, but also utilize the broad mandate of improving the health of Iraqi citizens to covertly expand the state's surveillance infrastructure, strengthen the cross-border policing of nomadic tribes, advance political attacks against neighboring states like Iran, and accelerate the displacement of poorer residents from valuable urban land. Moreover, the revolutionary potential of rural migrants and their support for the Iraqi Communist Party was subsumed within this public health discourse that argued that slum clearance and resettlement were merely efforts to save them from disease. Here you can see a propagandistic photograph that depicts a sanitized view of brick and concrete housing projects that were built in the early 60s to house displaced migrants. Next slide, please. In April of this year, I conducted an interview with the Iraqi novelist Abdullah Saki. He vividly recalled that when he was 5 years old in 1956, a group of female nurses clad in white skirt suits descended upon his neighborhood, which was located beyond the eastern flood dike in Baghdad. It is pictured here on the right. They went from dwelling to dwelling in an effort to gather children like him for inoculation. These nurses, however, were frequently accompanied by officials collecting census information and marking houses for demolition. Saki's family was part of a mass exodus of dispossessed cultivators from rural provinces who settled in vacant lots and flood-prone zones in and around the capital. In the map on the left, you can see the geographical distributions of migrant dwellings in Baghdad. In 1957, Iranian social worker Satare Farman described a typical dwelling, quote, "A single room must provide for all the household functions, which include living, sleeping, eating, cooking, washing, and the occasional accommodation of animals and fowl. Arising from this congested and highly unsanitary form of living are conditions which create an ideal environment for the development and spread of disease, squalor, and general ill health. Such diseases as smallpox, TB, and typhus are known to be prevalent, and the inhabitants in the areas under study unfortunately represent a continual danger to the health of the entire urban population." End quote. Farman's description of migrants as vectors of disease were commonly circulating in the Iraqi press. What they failed to mention was that Baghdad's more affluent and influential residents were dumping their waste and sewage in migrant neighborhoods, causing water and soil contamination, along with outbreaks of disease. Dr. Hashim Barakat, the director of health for the capital, described efforts his department undertook in 1957 to forcefully disinfect and fumigate migrant huts, though he explained that these measures were merely temporary. Next slide, please. The long-term plan had already been put in motion when Iraq's development board had hired the Greek firm of Doxiadis Associates to clear all reed and mud dwellings in the country and implement a national housing program. Under this program, Dr. Barakat proclaimed that the state would provide all migrants with clean water, roads, electricity, and resettlement to areas with schools and health clinics, which you can see in the posters here. These promises, however, were never fully realized, and year after year, when the Baghdad municipality would try to displace migrants from their neighborhoods, they would resist. Incidentally, in some neighborhoods, a significant portion of migrants were low-ranking members of the army and police. Thus, police officers were often put in a position where they had to arrest and even raze the dwellings of their neighbors. A DIA report recounted such an encounter in 1956, quote, "As a result to the action taken by the Asima Health Directorate of moving the Sarifas from the neighborhood of dirty water, some of the inhabitants refused and about 300 of them stood in the way of the official clerks and prevented them from doing their jobs, which obliged the municipality to ask for police help to investigate and punish the people responsible for that." End quote. What the Health Directorate did not mention was that the land that these migrants were occupying was becoming more valuable due not only to investment in public infrastructure, but also the completion of a major flood control project that meant that former flood zones would now become prime real estate for suburban development. If there is something that we can learn from the history of smallpox eradication in Baghdad for the COVID-19 pandemic, it is the relationship between evictions, policing, and public health discourse. Today, more than 20 million people are facing evictions throughout the United States. Where I'm located in Boston, Massachusetts, the vast majority, nearly 80% of these evictions target Black and immigrant communities of color, based on a recent report published by City Life and MIT professor Justin Steele. These working class communities also consist of those who are forced to be frontline workers and experience greater mortality rates and illness due to higher levels of exposure. Local landlord groups, real estate organizations, eviction units, and police departments, universities like Harvard and MIT, and local government, however, have been reluctant to support any long-term eviction moratoriums or rent cancellation because these policies would counter the decades of real estate speculation, corporate urban development, and land grabbing that has occurred in the greater Boston area. The pandemic today, just as the smallpox epidemic in 1950s Baghdad, thus provides an opportunity for mass evictions of working class communities whose grassroots organizing and protest movements are a direct threat to the authoritarian desires and political imagination of the current American regime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Homa, for this wonderful paper. Our last speaker is Susan Hayden, who is a senior lecturer in social pharmacy at the School of Pharmacy, University of Otago, New Zealand. She gained her PhD in history from the University of Otago. She's the author of 2 books, as well as a number of book chapters and journal articles. Her current project is Himalayan Roots of a Global Program, Nepal and Smallpox. The title of her talk today is House, Social Life, and Smallpox in Kathmandu in 1963.
Thank you for inviting me to come and talk today. For me, as I say, it's early morning. Now, while many countries around the world in the early 1960s no longer had cases of smallpox, in Nepal in 1963, it was still one of the many infectious diseases and much feared. Like its neighbor, India, it had the variola major form of the virus, which had a high mortality rate. Epidemics occurred every 4 to 5 years. Smallpox had no cure, but could be prevented through vaccination, although warm temperatures often rendered the vaccine ineffective. At a worldwide level, the World Health Assembly adopted a proposal in 1959 to eradicate smallpox. In 1980, smallpox was declared eradicated at the end of a global intensified program and remains the only human disease to have achieved such success. The virus, however, has not yet been destroyed. Now, this presentation is drawn from research from my wider project and is based on interviews I undertook with people who either had smallpox or had looked after children. So it focuses on social practice in the urban environment. The epidemic was part of Nepal's last major epidemic. There are no accurate statistics, but most of those who had smallpox for children indicates inadequate immunization levels in a community. Everyone, however, was at risk. While past Nepali history has examples of displacement of communities, this is not evident in these areas of Kathmandu in 1963. Next slide, please. Now, Kathmandu was the most densely populated part of Nepal, with narrow, busy streets and multi-storied houses crowded together, often around small courtyards. Many streets are much narrower than these streets just shown here, maybe some of them a meter wide. Any disease could spread easily. Smallpox was a highly visible disease. It was regularly present in the community, and word quickly spread when there was a case. People thought that the practice of spitting from windows spread the disease. Nepal's health services were very limited, even in the capital. And I think, as an aside, just listening from presentations today, I think we must realize just how limited these services were. And so what happened was that a person with smallpox was looked after in the home. What people knew about smallpox came from within the family. A person with smallpox was isolated from other family members, except for the person looking after them. They were given their food separately and had separate beds and sheets. Caring for someone with smallpox was very demanding, and some mothers had more than one child with the disease at a time to look after. And they were looked after their children until the dried scabs peeled off. Slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Across the valley was the temple complex of Swayambhunath, and you can see it on the hill. Spiritual offerings were an important part of responding to smallpox, but attitudes and practices varied among different communities. An important part of looking after someone with smallpox was going to the temple. With few and poor roads and limited access to transport, the carer usually went on foot, and the trip could take all day. Next slide, please. The small double-storied temple is for the goddess, who's known by various names: Harati or Ajuma to the local Niwa population, or Sitala, the Hindu goddess. So why can these practices be relevant to COVID-19 today? Many Kathmandu streets are still narrow, and infectious disease spreads most easily where people congregate together and live in crowded living conditions. But with multi-storied houses, it was possible to isolate within the house. Of course, when the person went to the temple, the carer had likely had the disease and so was immune, or had been vaccinated, but it was very limited and so many weren't. And so was unlikely to spread the disease or bring it back into the community. Looking after someone with smallpox at home meant the disease could be managed in places where there was a poor or limited health infrastructure. In fact, people did better. And lastly, good care, and the care was extremely loving, was important, and remains so as we know today with COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this wonderful presentation, bringing our panels to a conclusion. So now I'm going to move to my comments. I want to kind of warn that since we have a lot of questions, I'm going to limit my comments to very general observations. Okay, so the panels today focus on the impact of epidemics on urban design, public health policies, and social dislocation in cities in Asia, Africa, South America, the US, and elsewhere during the modern era by an interdisciplinary group of scholars. In many ways, they complement, in an important way, the two-day symposium on epidemic urbanism organized by Mohammad and Caitlin in May, which is now available on YouTube. I'm a historian of early modern Islamic and Eastern Mediterranean cities and have examined through my own work the impact of trade, travel, and contact in the spread of pandemics and municipal responses to them in early modern Istanbul. I have argued that due to its location and growing trade with Europe, Istanbul was a hub of pandemics as well as a cross-section of different medical cultures and practices and urban designs. Having said that, I can offer some comparative observations based on my own research and the papers today on the relevance of past experiences to the current pandemic, continuities as well as changes in how cities were impacted by epidemics and how municipal and public health authorities intervened in shaping the post-pandemic city. Many of the papers today focus on the French and British and other colonial governments and their responses to epidemics through urban interventions, social, political, and public health policies, their successes as well as failures. In cities that came under European imperial administration, colonial regimes changed the physical layout of cities by creating settler communities in new cores and modern quarters, pushing the poor and indigenous populations into marginal and traditional areas of the city. They also, in many ways, disrupted the ecological balance in these cities. They set up modern infrastructures like modern housing, modern street planning, sewage and water distribution systems, street lighting, insurance companies, modern transportation, and modern healthcare facilities like quarantines to fight pandemics and fires. We have to keep in mind that the commercial and economic interests of colonial regimes played a key role in their urban policies. However, in many instances, facilities like modern hospitals were only available to the European elites and their local dependents. Oftentimes, modern healthcare systems were established through Christian missionaries and catered primarily to European and Christian communities. In other words, while colonial regimes westernized the infrastructure of Asian and African, as well as Middle Eastern cities, and set up modern healthcare facilities, we have to pay close attention to the spatial dimension of these facilities and their beneficiaries. While many also attended to the poor, they often intensified social polarization in terms of who received care. We also observe these trends in modern cities where COVID-19 patients receive differential treatment or no treatment at all, depending on their socioeconomic status and where they are located in the city. However, as we know, pandemics spread fast and affect everyone and might eventually change the social dynamics and improve things for the poor if they resist or make things worse. At the same time, the rich can afford to leave overcrowded areas of cities where pandemics rage to the suburbs and the countryside. We have seen this in the US today. In Istanbul, the movement of the dynastic household and elites from the walled city to their waterfront palaces and mansions along the Bosphorus was a response to epidemics as well as fires. In Istanbul also, the ruling class built tulip gardens, private and public parks in the emerging new boulevards and cityscapes of pleasure during the 18th century. The female members of the Ottoman household also built Baroque fountains all over the city, the image of which is available on our roster brochure today, in order to provide clean water for the denizens and improve public hygiene. These parks and fountains became the new foci of outdoor activities and social interactions along the water and away from crowded and dense neighborhoods. Cemeteries became places of promenade and sociability, where poetry of loss and mourning, as well as symbols such as the tree of life, covered tombstones, themselves artistically designed. Prayers for the dead were not banned, but were held in outdoor spaces in Istanbul. We see a similar trend in the design of public parks in Chicago, where I am now, a city that went through massive transformation as a result of the Great Fire of 1871, 1 year after the Great Fire of Istanbul. I'm sure global climate conditions had something to do with this historical convergence. This workshop and the previous two-day symposium have shown us how cities across different geographies and time periods emerged from the health crisis of the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. We may ponder what will be the future of our cities as we recover from the current COVID-19 crisis. Will there be a movement out of the city to the suburbs and smaller towns, as was the case during pandemics in 18th century Istanbul? How will the balance between indoor and outside activities and the need for ventilation, social distancing, and public hygiene change the face of our cities, housing, workplace, as well as medical and educational facilities? What will be the outcome of the increasing authority of the state and its surveillance regime in monitoring our movements through cityscapes, travel, border crossing, and our medical history? Finally, how can our historical research and findings inform the public at large, our students, and engage government authorities and public health officials to think creatively, locally and globally about the future of our own cities and their denizens during the current pandemic? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, three of us, so much for that thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion that you just had, so responding to all the panelists that we've had today. I just have a few remarks myself before we begin the Q&A session. As an architectural historian, my research examines the artistic, social, political, economic, and cultural context of the built environment in Mughal South Asia. And this multi-pronged approach to my research also informs my teaching. And what's clear from this fantastic presentation, from our fantastic presentations from our panelists today, is that we as educators can neither examine nor discuss epidemic urbanism without utilizing a broad interdisciplinary approach. So just drawing out some of the themes of our three panels and hearing the case studies presented, even in their very abridged forms, we are made to realize that many of the issues which must be taken into consideration when examining the intersection of epidemics, urban responses, and challenges, and government oversight, all of these things are coming together. And some of these include, and this is just to name a few, the geopolitical ramifications of government policy on the built environment, the impact of climate and climate change, societal economic disparity, ecological factors, the movement of populations, the impact of humans in our own everyday habits and the practices not only on the cities that we live in, but with their ability to cope and respond to epidemics. And then of course we have to take into account societal responsibility, the use of media and visual imagery, and the reactions of both states and religious institutions to these particular situations. And as we can see through all the presentations that we've seen today, this is something which has to be realized was dealt with historically. It's not something that we are just dealing with in the current pandemic situation today. So really, for a lot of us, when we're thinking about how to approach the historical study of epidemics and urbanism, and even more so in light of how relevant all of these issues which have come up in our panelists' talk today, how relevant they are in mapping out the responses to global pandemics, it's something we really need to keep in mind. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the Q&A portion, and we've had quite a few questions come through throughout the sessions, and we're going to get to as many as we can. Some of these are for particular panelists, and some are more to the general group. And if I could ask all the participants from today to please now turn on your cameras and be a part of the overall Q&A discussion. So one of the things which really reverberated for me throughout all the presentations today is how societal inequity plays a part in the in the pandemic responses, and how it affects the populations being affected. And this is something which one of the questions which came up for the entire panel has been brought up as well. And it has to do with a combination of colonialism as well as how the different populations react. So the question is, and this is for anybody who wants to address it, did local officials see the spread of disease in colonial and imperial cities primarily as an urban issue or as a public health issue? Or was there a particularly colonial or imperial response? And to what extent were these attempts to fight the spread of disease informed by measures taken in other cities within a particular empire or by measures taken in other empires? If anyone would like to respond to that. Yeah, Gregory, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I can go quickly. As far as my case, I think the plague outbreak began as an urban concern, but really spread quite rapidly into the countryside in Senegal and just became a recurring endemic issue into the 1940s. So it might have started urban, but became kind of a fundamental question for the order of the functioning colonial Senegal. And also it became a justification for spreading colonial power into the hinterlands. As far as kind of connections with other imperial domains, the plague outbreak, I mean, as we've seen, was spreading throughout the 1890s and 1900s, and there was knowledge about it in practices in the sanitation syndrome that I referred to, but strangely with the plague outbreak, there was a lack of preparedness. The French authorities were aware that the plague was spreading in other places, even in nearby Mauritania, but in Senegal, they remained convinced that their quarantine measures were adequate and that they would not need to implement the kind of strategies taken elsewhere. But when it arrived, they did end up kind of playing by a very similar playbook to what was seen in Nairobi, Cape Town, so across imperial boundaries, but even within the French Empire itself. So it's almost selective use and selective referral to other places that both marred and defined their response to the plague outbreak.
Thank you, Gregory. Does anybody else want to respond to this question? Timothy?
Thank you very much. I think it's a bit of both. It's both an urban issue and public health issue for the colonial masters in our own part of the world, because they are kind of response to it, because they are part of the population. And just like we are seeing now, the virus doesn't know anybody. It doesn't discriminate between the local and the foreign, or the white or the blacks. So even then, the disease spread everywhere. It affected both the governed and the governed. I mean, the imperial masters themselves, they are part of the whole thing. So they have to think of a kind of holistic way to address the matter in Lagos and in Nigeria for that matter. So they have to quickly think of ways to isolate themselves, first of all, and that's why they come up with that kind of policy, of having what we call GRA, Government Reserve Area. And it's so popular in our own part of the world now. We still have those conclaves, even at the moment, in Lagos, in all parts of Nigeria, even outside Nigeria, and all part of Africa, where we have all the elites and the affluent living now. In those days, in the 1918, 1920, 1940s, pre-independent Nigeria, we only have the European living in those conclaves. I mean, what we call GRAs, just because they want to separate themselves from the locals. And that is just a kind of impact of this pandemic, that we see. So they look at it both ways, as a kind of health issue, and at the same time as an urban, problem. So they have to carve out themselves away from the people quickly. So when we have independence in Nigeria, they left those places, and then the elites, the well-read, the doctors, the engineers, move into those places, to stay now. So we have that kind of dichotomy even existing up to now, and also turning to what we call gated communities in our own part of the world. So what am I saying? So they look at the health issue. They even brought people from abroad. Medicine is not enough, so they have to look inward into what we call local medicine. The herbalists, they have to ask them to bring their herbs, to bring their various local things to cure, because the medicine cannot go around that time. Just like we are seeing in the play now, Madagascar is saying that they have cure to COVID-19. Similar thing happened then. In fact, they have to combat the influenza with the local herbs, and it kind of works in some places, and it kind of saves some people. And the medical doctors like Dr. Shakpara that I mentioned, and J.K. Randu, of 1918, 1920s, they have to look at those, concussions, so to say, and find a way to, give it out to people to help them, because, the hospital cannot take people again. We have so many deaths. So in a way, it's both. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think I also saw Michael had your hand up in response to this, and then we'll move on to another question.
Yeah, just very quickly, in colonial Vietnam, the authorities viewed the plague as an urban problem, as with the cities. There's very little discussion of it in the countryside that I've seen. And second, the plague and also the cholera issues definitely fused urbanism and public health. In the French tradition, public health is definitely a part of urbanism, but in these crises that I look at in the early 20th century, they really become one, so that by the time we get to the 1930s, there's no light between public health and urbanism in the colony.
Okay, thank you so much. Questions just come in, which is something which I was thinking about as well, and it relates to this idea about this use of kind of othering and scapegoating when we're talking about these societies in a colonial context, but also in a present-day context. And so the question is, was there a tension between colonial policies and the indigenous perspective in addressing the health crisis? And I think this is a question we can expand out to also address how the current crisis is affecting or is being affected by the same kind of thought process. So if somebody would like to pick up with this particular question. Mohammad, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to give my response to the earlier question as well. We need to remember that 19th century theories of disease were usually those of miasmatic disease theories, and they were very much interested in the geography rather than on the effect of microorganisms. So in a sense, if I speak of my area of interest, which is Dhaka, so the colonial government was very stingy in terms of expenditure in public health, and because of this, they usually resorted to kind of typifying the people as being very dirty, and the city was seen as very unhygienic and filthy, and kind of a lost cause. So I think that goes on with the kind of division that you mentioned in terms of tensions between the colonized and the colonized as well. So this is my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you, Mohammad. Would anyone else like to come in on that one? Michael, please.
Yeah, so 2 things about the otherizing. I think the xenophobia is so important in the discussion of the plague, both in colonial Vietnam, but throughout Southeast Asia, Honolulu, and onto California, San Francisco as well. So it's really a global phenomenon there. And we obviously are seeing that today with certain political figures, unfortunate rhetoric. Also, I wanted to point out that in my case study in Hanoi, the Vietnamese openly questioned the municipal authorities and the medical health experts about why the Vietnamese community was subject to more rigorous public health measures than the French community. And that became a real point of contention and a point of sort of growing anti-colonial resistance.
Great, thank you so much. Moving on to some particular questions. Alan, these are for you. One is a very precise question asking approximately how many people were infected with smallpox in Terre. And the other question is, how can we explain this continuing resistance and refusal to follow public health guidelines during pandemics in the US? And do we see the same trend elsewhere? I suppose that last question can be for the other speakers as well. But Alan, if you could start.
It turns out that the first question's harder than you'd think. There's some major discrepancies in numbers from the state and the city boards of health. But one thing we do have is the newspaper reported the names of smallpox victims on a daily basis through the winter of 02 and 03. That gives us about 50 or 60 cases a month. Seems to be the most reasonable number, and that number doubles the next year. So all told, probably over 1,000 in a city of 34,000 people or so. So I think there's a broader sense of the resistance, especially the vaccination and smallpox in the 20th century America. It's bundled up with a lot of connected social ideas. People saw resistance to these measures as a sort of a fundamental liberty, personal liberty kind of thing, so that the government can't tell me what to do sort of perspective, which sounds very familiar to us today too. There's a really great study on that, a book-length study on smallpox and how the vaccination question led to some major changes in American perspectives on social control and so forth. But I let the group as a whole talk about, repercussions elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to pick up on the idea of how can we explain this idea, this continued idea of a resistance to follow public health guidelines and a refusal to act in a collegiate societal manner when common sense would dictate that this is one of the things which is going to get us through this?
Could I pick up, because I'd like to follow up further on the the sort of the attitudes to vaccination.
Yes, please.
Because it's very much part of my research, and I think one of the things it tends to be vaccine and context specific, and some of the reasons around attitudes to vaccination in Nepal at this time in 1963 that came up. We often tend to think because there's the smallpox goddess that people are against vaccination. Now, there's a whole variety of attitudes. And in fact, one of the doctors I spoke to basically sort of said to people, look, worship the goddess, but please, still vaccinate. And most people, if they got the opportunity to get vaccination, were vaccinated, but most people didn't get the opportunity. But there are also lots of practical reasons why people weren't necessarily except having been vaccinated. Like the vaccinators would come round at the time when everybody, although this is an urban area, they often had fields, and so they wouldn't be at home. Lots of different practical issues. So there was a whole spectrum of ideas around vaccination sort of at the time. And I think often what we tend to do is we tend to sort of close in and pick up on one or two points and not really listen and understand what the issues are to different people in different places at different times.
Thank you, Susan. And this is something I was wondering actually, because, okay, sorry. I've seen Gregory and Huma had their hand up as well in response. So Huma, do you want to start and then we'll go to Gregory?
Yeah, I wanted to continue with what Susan was saying, and in response to kind of the, I would say, variegated responses to resisting vaccination or resisting public health guidelines. I think that one of the things I wasn't able to do in the presentation today was speak about how in the landscape of kind of poorer and working class communities, there's, it's not, they're not monolithic attitudes, there's differences. And so, for instance, in Western Baghdad, there's a neighborhood called Shakriya in the 50s, which is largely populated by police officers and soldiers. And there's a Greek architect, Maria Zagorisio, who's doing architectural studies in these so-called slums to create plans for slum clearance and resettlement. And she notices that in this neighborhood, when she's walking through, even though she's an architect, that women are coming up to her and asking her to inoculate their children, thinking that because she's this white woman, that perhaps she's a doctor. Then she travels to the east in the neighborhood that I showed you in the slide, to the neighborhood called Asima, where Abdullah Sahi is from. And there people are terrified of this kind of inoculation campaign to some degree in certain areas, because it of course accompanies, slum clearance and demolition of houses and census and enumeration and sort of other sorts of invasive surveillance and disciplining measures. And so I think that what happens in this moment is that, it becomes difficult for economically and socially marginalized groups to trust state interventions when elite-backed economic programs masquerade as public health campaigns, creating a false choice between unsafe living conditions or further displacement and dispossession. And so I think that sometimes we have to also consider what is a larger political and economic context in which people are resisting or being fearful. And today, for instance, there are anti-vaccination groups who are specifically targeting Black communities because of the history of the ways in which Black people became subjects to terrible, terrible health experiments. And so there's a historical legacy in which, certain communities might be more concerned about that kind of state intervention. That is not to suggest that anti-vaccination is an appropriate, position to hold, but I do think that, one needs not be so condescending in thinking about why and where these attitudes are located and coming from.
Thank you, Hama. Gregory, I saw you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, so quickly, I think what I have to say kind of ties in quite well about this concern about the lack of trust in the ambitions of health policies that are informed by longer kind of political and economic histories and that are often very site-specific. So in my situation, one of the largest groups that were protesting in Dakar were the indigenous Lebu communities who had certain land ownership rights, but often the French government throughout the past 20 years before the plague would kind of switch on whether these rights were collective or enforceable or protectable whenever they wanted to expand the city. And this fueled a lot of the protests and political mobilization that led in the same year of the plague outbreak to the first election of a Black African deputy to the National Assembly, largely on the grounds of dispossession in the city. And when home destructions and displacement emerged, many of these residents saw these policies as simply a continuation of efforts to displace them to get valuable land in the city's kind of transformation. And so they read it, and in many ways they read that accurately. If you read the government reports, they were using this as a way to justify displacement. And so there's a sense, I think, that it came at a crisis of faith in the government that was endemic in many societies, certainly many colonial societies, that kind of made the authority of health officials extremely questionable, and they were seen, it's read in a continuation of previous practices that informs these specific responses to either anti-vaccination or disobeying health measures. So I think the need to understand these longer term kind of ways of reading political situations and political dynamics inform the seemingly objective truth of or authority of health measures.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one last question, which will be open to all the panelists, but we only have time for possibly 2, maybe 3 short responses. So the question is, in quite a lot of the presentations, there was this tension between urban and rural centers. And so with thinking about the responses of the rural centers and societies to epidemics, particularly in the absence of healthcare facilities and official healthcare facilities, what is something you can say about that? And again, we have time for a couple brief responses to that question. Anyone?
I think the question
right. I will just briefly, because I'm only just talking about one part. In Kathmandu, where you'd expect services. Now, most of Nepal is at this time is 96% rural, and I followed an epidemic in another sort of in another area, and this is very much that if you've got no services, if there are nothing, you fall to your own resources, and you find ways. So in case of smallpox, one of these people, they moved, the fact they had smallpox, in fact they moved out of the village to another field area where they weren't close, and you just removed yourself. It's just but you just had to fall on your own resources if there was nothing coming from the state.
Thank you, Susan. So we've got time for just one more question, and this is actually for Yichi. In your presentation, you were talking about gardens and garden spaces, and if you can just tell us a little bit about the role of gardens before the arrival of the British, and in Chinese culture, were these spaces regarded as healing spaces? For example, in the Middle East and Central Asia, in the medieval early modern period, gardens have this kind of real inherent quality to them, which can be used for healing. And is there any kind of role in China for that type of for the garden?
Okay, so the gardens, the contemporary concept of public parks is introduced and by the British arrivals. So before that time, the Chinese has gardens, but this garden is totally different from the public parks we can see today and in the contemporary society. So, and for that gardens, so normally we can say it has indoor gardens and private gardens. So imperial gardens, but all of them are belonged by the ruling classes. So so both of them are owned and enjoyed by just the people. So they must be used as private functions. So their owners and can invite people and enjoy the times in the gardens. But this parks not always and open to the public. So this cannot be called as public parks. So even it has some even sometimes they open to the public at some particular days and at different times, but mainly used as private functions. When the foreign settlers, or we can call British and French settlers, arrived in China in the treaty port, they also introduced the public parks into their settlements. However, this is the main function of these public parks has been used as enclosure, and they has two functions, mainly used to beautify city, and also they just divided the old side of the settlements into different small lots, and they sell these lots, just like the current real estate market. So they can show the master plan of the settlement to say, okay, this side is near the parks, so the land price of the site should be more expensive. This is the main function of public parks before this happened. But after plague, and so the people just realized the public health function of public parks. So they just introduced more and more facilities, and also the idea on the public health into the public parks. And then the public parks has developed into the function of public health. And also at the same time, they also introduced the other functions, just like care of the children and also the sport. And then this is the public parks just developed and from the enclosure of the treaty ports into we can see the designed landscape in the contemporary China, or at the same as the other design landscape in the other cities around the world.
Okay,
this is
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, nice.
So we are basically out of time now. So I'm sorry for the questions we didn't get to, but we will pass them on to the speakers, and you'll have a chance to hear from them. And now I'd like to hand it back to Caitlin and Mohammad, and thank all of the wonderful participants for today for your amazing presentations.
Yes, thank you. Let me just echo very quickly, just a huge round of thanks to our speakers today for their wonderful presentations. All the attendees here, thanks so much for sticking with us, for your attention, for your insights, for the wonderful questions. To Marine and Fariba for your expert facilitation and reflections. And of course, last but not least, to Eliana and GAHTC for all you're doing to support and convene this symposium. We just wanted to let you all know that we have one more conversation coming up next Saturday. We hope you can join us. Mohammad has shared a revised poster in the chat, and we'll also be sharing our email address as well if you have any questions. But the spirit of this roundtable is in response to current conversations and challenges with social and racial inequity, and really to extend the dialogue that has emerged here and in our inaugural symposium about how epidemics exploit and amplify social inequities. We're organizing this roundtable next Saturday, and it's titled Cities, Social Equity and Pandemics in History. We sincerely hope that you join us. This session today, as well as the one coming up on August 1st, will be available through GAHTC, as well as on our Epidemic Urbanism YouTube channel. So lots of ways to connect with us in the future. Just want to say one more time, thanks to everyone for a wonderful day. Be healthy and be safe, and thanks again.